Now, the purpose of the Bible is to testify of Jesus Christ. The Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, points to Christ.
The Bible is true in a very strange way. What you do as an educated person is sample that structure that constitutes the sum total of the texts of our civilization.
Because if those four things are true, that there's truth, that God exists, that miracles are possible, and the New Testament is reliable enough to let us know that the resurrection occurred, then Christianity is true. Because if Jesus rose from the dead, game over, Christianity is true.
So, what is the food you give to the soul? It is reading the Bible, the Word of God. And I don't care who you are, you cannot live a victorious life if you neglect Bible reading and Bible study.
But what we have at stake here is far more than that. You know, your life depends on this book. So read it.
Pulpit Commentary, Exodus chapter 14, verses 1 through 4. The direction of the journey changed. Hitherto the march of the Israelites had been to the southeast. Another day's journey in this direction would have taken them beyond the limits of Egypt, into the desert region east of the Bitter Lakes, which was dry, treeless, and waterless. In this tract there would have been but scant nourishment for their flocks and herds, and absolutely no water for themselves, unless it had been obtained by miracle. God therefore changed the direction of their route from southeast to due south, and made them take a course by which they placed the Bitter Lakes on their left hand, and so remained within the limits of Egypt in a district fairly well watered, but shut off from the wilderness by the Bitter Lakes, and the northern prolongation of the Gulf of Suez, with which they were connected. This route suited the immediate convenience of the host and, having no suspicion of any hostile movement on the part of the Egyptians, they not unnaturally made no objection to it. It had, however, the disadvantage, in case of a hostile movement, of shutting them in between their assailants on the one hand and the sea upon the other. And this circumstance seems to have led Pharaoh to make his pursuit. Verse 2 Speak unto the children of Israel that they turn. Kalish translates return, i.e., retrace their steps, and supposes that Etham lay far south of Pi-Hahiroth, on the west coast of the Gulf of Suez. But the Hebrew word means either turn back or turn aside, and is translated here Pomicron Sigmet Rosialphin Tapsilon, and not Nu Alpha Sigmet Rosialphin Tapsilon by the Septuagint. Dr. Brugge supposes that the turn made was to the north, and the sea reached the Mediterranean. But all other writers, regarding the sea spoken of as the Red Sea, compare Exodus chapter 13 verse 18, believe the divergence from the previous route to have been towards the south, and place Pi-Hahiroth, Migdal, and Baal-zephon in this quarter. Pi-Hahiroth. The exact position is known. Neither the Egyptian remains nor the writings of the Greeks or Romans present us with any similar geographic name. If Semitic, the word should mean the entrance to the caves. But it is quite possible that it may be Egyptian. Migdal. There was undoubtedly a famous Migdal, or Maktal, on the eastern frontier of Egypt, which was a strong fortified post, and which is often mentioned. Hecataeus called it Magdalos, c. 282. In the itinerary of Antonine, it is said to be 12 Roman miles from Pelusium, page 76. But this is too northern a position for the Migdal of the present passage, which must represent a tower or fortified post not very remote from the modern Suez. Over against Baal-zephon. The accumulation of names, otherwise unknown to the sacred writers, is a strong indication of the familiarity possessed by the author of Exodus with the geography of the country. No late writer could have ventured on such local details. A name resembling Baal-zephon is said to occur in the Egyptian monuments. Dr. Brugge reads it as Baal-zapuna. He regards it as the designation of a Phoenician god, and compares Baal-zebub. Others have compared the Zephon with the Greco-Egyptian form Typhon, and have supposed Baal-zephon to be equivalent to Baal-set or Baal. Setek, a personification of the principle of evil. Verse 3, they are entangled in the land, or they are confused, perplexed, i.e., they have lost their way. Pharaoh could not conceive that they would have taken the route to the west of the bitter lakes, which conducted to no tolerable territory, unless they were hopelessly at sea with respect to the geography of the country. In this perplexity of theirs, he thought he saw his own opportunity. The wilderness has shut them in. Pharaoh is thinking of his own wilderness, the desert country between the Nile Valley and the Red Sea. This desert, he says, blocks their way and shuts them, and they cannot escape if he follows in their steps. For they will have the sea on one hand, the desert on the other, and in their front, while he himself presses upon their rear. Verse 4, I will be honored. See the comment on Exodus chapter 9 verse 16. That the Egyptians may know that I am the Lord. Compare above, chapter 7, verses 5 through 9, the pursuit of Israel by the Egyptians. A short respite from suffering was sufficient to enable Pharaoh to recover from his extreme alarm. No further deaths had followed on the destruction of the firstborn, and he might think no further danger was to be apprehended. The worst of Moses' threats had been accomplished. Perhaps Jehovah had no more arrows in his quiver. At any rate, as he realized to himself what it would be to lose altogether the services of so vast a body of slaves, many of them highly skilled in different arts, he more and more regretted the permission which he had given. Under these circumstances, intelligence was brought him of the change which the Israelites had made in their route, and the dangerous position into which they had brought themselves. Upon this, he resolved to start in pursuit, with such troops as he could hastily muster. As his chariots were 600, we may presume that his footmen were at least 100,000. All trained and disciplined soldiers, accustomed to warfare. The timid horde of escaped slaves, and used to war, though it might be 5 or 6 times as numerous as his host, was not likely to resist it. Pharaoh no doubt expected an unconditional surrender on the part of the Israelites. As soon as they saw his forces, verse 5, it was told the king of Egypt that the people fled. Pharaoh, when he let the Israelites go, must have felt tolerably certain that they would not voluntarily return. Formerly, however, he had only consented to their going a 3 days' journey into the wilderness. Exodus chapter 12 verse 31. When, being at Etham, on the edge of the wilderness, they did not enter it, but marched southward to Pi-hahiroth. The Egyptians might naturally report that instead of sacrificing, they were flying hasting forwards, placing as much distance as they could between themselves and the Egyptian headquarters. But this report alone would scarcely have moved Pharaoh to action. It was in the accompanying circumstances, in the particular line of route, that he thought to find his opportunity. The people were entangled, verse 3. They might be taken at a disadvantage, and might be reduced to choosing between starvation and a return to Egypt. The heart of Pharaoh, and of his servants, was turned against the people. The reaction of feeling was not confined to Pharaoh. His subjects participated in it. The loss of such a large body of laborers would be generally felt as a severe blow to the prosperity of the nation. It would affect all classes. The poor laborers might be benefited, but the employers of labor are the influential classes, and they would be injured. So Pharaoh's servants were of one mind with their master, and they turned against the Israelites. Why have we done this? In the retrospect, the afflictions which they had suffered did not seem so very great. They at any rate had survived them, and were not perhaps even seriously impoverished. Royal favor will find a way of making up any losses which court minions have suffered out of the general taxation of the country. But in prospect, the loss of 600,000 more or less skilled laborers appeared a terrible thing. The official class was quite ready to make a strenuous effort to avert the loss. Verse 6, he made ready his chariot. The Egyptian monarchs, from the time of the 18th dynasty, always went out to war in a chariot. The chariots were, like the Greek and the Assyrian, open behind, and consisted of a semicircular standing beard of wood, from which rose in a graceful curve the antics, or rim to the height of about 2 feet, and a half above the standing beard. The chariot had 2 wheels and a pole, and was drawn by 2 horses. It ordinarily contained 2 men only, the warrior and the charioteer. Verse 7, 600 chosen chariots. Diodorus Siculus assigns to one Egyptian king a force of 27,000 chariots, which, however, is probably beyond the truth. But the 1,200 assigned to Shishak's 2 Chronicles, chapter 12 verse May 3rd well be regarded as historical, and the great kings of the 19th dynasty would possess at least an equal number. The 600 chosen chariots set in motion on this occasion probably constituted a division of the royal bodyguard. The remaining force would be collected from the neighboring cities of northern Egypt, as Memphis, Heliopolis, Bubastis, Pithom, and Pelusium. Captains over every one of them. Rather, captains over the whole of them. So the Septuagint, the Vulgate and Syriac version. Some, however, understand warriors in each of them, according to Gesenius, Bottager, Kalish. Verse 8, the children of Israel went out with a high hand, i.e., boldly and confidently, not as fugitives, but as men in the exercise of their just fights, perhaps with a certain amount of ostentation. Verse 9, all the horses and chariots of Pharaoh, rather, all the chariot horses. There is no end in the original. His horsemen, rather his riders, or mounted men, i.e., those who rode in the chariots. That the Egyptians had a powerful cavalry at a later date appears from 2 Chronicles chapter 12 verse 3, but the Hebrew text of Exodus, in remarkable accordance with the native monuments of the time, represents the army of this Pharaoh as composed of 2 descriptions of troops, only a chariot and an infantry force. See Hengstenberg, Egyptian UND Mose, pages 127-9. Overtook them. It is uncertain how long the Israelites remained encamped at Pi-Hahiroth. They would wait so long as the pillar of the cloud did not move. Numbers chapter 9 verse 18, 19, and 20. It must have taken Pharaoh a day to hear of their march from Etham, at least another day to collect his troops, and 3 or 4 days to effect the march from Tanis to Pi-Hahiroth. The Jewish tradition that the Red Sea was crossed on the night of the 21st of Nisan Abib is, therefore, conceivably a true one. Verses 10 through 14, the terror of Israel and the courage of Moses. It has been argued that the Israelites, if they were so numerous as stated Exodus chapter 12 verse 37, must have been wretched cowards, if they were afraid to risk an engagement with such an army as that hastily levied one which Pharaoh had brought with him. But the difference between an army of trained soldiers, thoroughly equipped for war, with helmets, shields, breastplates, swords, and spears, and an undisciplined multitude, unarmed for the most part, and wholly unaccustomed to warfare, is such that the latter, whatever its numbers, may be excused if it does not feel able to cope with the former, and declines an engagement. Numbers, without military training and discipline, are of no avail, nay, are even a disadvantage, since the men impede one another. It is not necessary to suppose that the Israelites were debased in character by their long servitude to account for their panic on seeing the army of Pharaoh. They had good grounds for their fear. Humanly speaking, resistance would simply have led to their indiscriminate massacre. The alarm of the Hebrews, and even the reproaches with which they assail Moses, are thus quite natural under the circumstances. What is surprising is the noble courage and confidence of Moses. Moses, though only vaguely informed that God would be honored upon Pharaoh and all his host, verse 4, is perfectly certain that all will go well. How the result will be achieved, he knows not. But he is sure that Israel will be delivered. And Egypt discomfited, his people have no reason to fear, they have but to stand still and see the salvation of God. Verse 13, the Lord will fight for them, they will have simply to hold their peace. Verse 14. Verse 10, they were sore afraid. Before the Israelites are taxed with cowardice, let it be considered, one, that they were unarmed. Egypt was so settled a government that civilians generally went unarmed. And slaves, like the Hebrews, would scarcely have been allowed to possess any arms if the case had been otherwise. 2. They had no military training. Whatever had been done to teach them order and arrangement in connection with their proposed journey, we may be sure there had been no drill or training in the use of arms, since this would have been regarded by the Egyptians as open rebellion. 3. They were quite unaccustomed to warfare. The Pharaoh's maintained large garrisons of Egyptian and mercenary troops in the frontier provinces to resist the invasions to which they were liable. The Hebrews may have had occasionally to defend themselves against a hasty raid, but in real war they had stood aloof and left the fighting to the regular Egyptian army. The children of Israel cried out unto the Lord. The appeal to Jehovah showed that, with all their weaknesses and imperfections, the Israelites were yet true at heart. They knew where alone help was to be obtained, and made their appeal accordingly. No cry is more sure of an answer than the despairing one, Lord, save us, we perish. Verse 11. And they said to Moses, it was not unnatural that, while flying to God as their only refuge, they should be angry with Moses. Moses, they would argue, ought to have known better than to have brought them into a situation of such peril. He, the leader, should have known the geography of the country. He, the courtier, should have known the temper of the court. It is always a satisfaction to men to vent their anger upon someone when they are in a difficulty. No graves in Egypt. Egypt, with a necropolis outside every city, was a land of tombs. Surely they might have found graves there, instead of being led out to such a distance simply to die. Verse 12, is not this the word that we did tell thee? The reference was probably to that time of depression, after their burdens had been increased, and before the series of miracles began, when the Israelites had addressed reproaches to Moses and Aaron, Exodus chapter 5 verse 21, and refused to listen to words of encouragement, Exodus chapter 6 verse 9. It was not true that they had uniformly held the same language, and desired Moses and Aaron to cease their efforts. It had been better for us to serve the Egyptians than that we should die. The spirit to prefer death to slavery, where they are the only alternatives, is not a common one, and we must not be surprised that a people which had grown up in servitude and had no traditions of national independence did not rise to the heroic height attained under other circumstances by Greeks, by Switzers, and by Poles. It would have been most extraordinary had they done so. Verse 13, and Moses said, fear ye not. Moses knew that the pursuit of Israel by the host of the Egyptians was a part of the counsel of God, and was to tend in some way or other to the promotion of God's honor and glory. Verse 4. He had sufficient faith to believe in a deliverance the nature of which it is not likely that he could anyway conjecture, whether hail would fall from heaven and destroy them, Joshua chapter 10 verse 11, or the earth gape and swallow them up, Numbers chapter 16 verse 32, or the angel of death smite them all in the night, 2 Kings chapter 19 verse 35, or any other strange form of destruction come upon them. He did not know, but he concluded from what had been revealed to him that God was about to vindicate his own honor without the aid of man. Hence his word, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which assigned to the Israelites a mere passive attitude of expectation for the Egyptians, etc. The order of the words in the original favors the marginal rendering, which is to be adopted with one slight change. Translate for, as ye have seen the Egyptians today, ye shall see them again no more forever. I.e., ye shall see them no more alive, vigorous and menacing, but still and lifeless upon the Red Sea shore. Verse 30. There is no reference to any other Egyptians than those with Pharaoh in the camp, nor to any later relations between Egypt and the chosen people. Verse 14, ye shall hold your peace, i.e., do nothing, remain at rest. Verses 15 through 18, God's answer to Moses' prayer. To the faithful prayer of Moses, albeit pitched perhaps in too low a key, God made gracious answer. A cry had been unnecessary, since his word was already pledged to bring his people safe to Canaan, and to get himself honor upon Pharaoh in connection with the pursuit. Verse 4. But, as the appeal has been made, he responds with a plain statement of what is now to be done. First, the Israelites are to make themselves ready for a forward movement. Verse 15. Second, Moses is to stretch out his rod over the Red Sea, and it will be divided. Third, the Israelites are then to make the passage on dry ground. Fourth, the Egyptians are to follow, and then honor is to be gotten upon them, and they are to know by the result that God is indeed Jehovah. Verses 15 and 16. Wherefore criest thou to me? It is evident that Moses, while boldly encouraging the people, himself needed the support and consolation of prayer. The Syriac translator shows us that he divined the fact aright. When he without authority intruded the words, Moses then cried to Jehovah. The form of the divine reply to his prayer seems to indicate a certain amount of reproach, as if Moses himself had become unduly anxious. Speak unto the children of Israel that they go forward. The Israelites were not to rest in their encampment, but to form in line of march, and descend to the very shore of the sea, and there hold themselves in readiness. Moses was to lift up his rod, the rod with which his other miracles had been wrought, and stretch out his hand over the sea, and then the drying up was to begin. Thus was most of the night passed. Verse 17. I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians. Here, and here only, are the hearts of the Egyptians generally said to have been hardened. Whatever meaning we attach to the expression, there will be no more difficulty in applying it to them than to Pharaoh. They had made themselves partakers in the monarch's guilt by mustering in hot haste when he summoned them, and had allowed themselves to revel in the anticipation of plunder and carnage. Exodus chapter 15 verse 9. Under such circumstances, the general laws which govern human nature would be quite sufficient to make their hearts grow hard. They shall follow them. Upon this act rash, if the phenomenon had been a mere natural one, presumptuous and infatuated, if the drying up were regarded as miraculous, depended altogether the destruction of the Egyptians, they had only to have stood still and allowed the escape which a week previously they had done their best to encourage, in order to have remained safe and unhurt. It was their stupidity and bloodthirstiness which alone brought them into any danger. Upon his horsemen, rather his chariot men. See the comment on verse 9. Verse 18. The Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. All Egypt would learn the destruction of the host, and the circumstances under which it occurred, whose miraculous nature could not be concealed. And the consequence would be a wide recognition of the superior might of Jehovah, the God of Israel, over that of any of the Egyptian deities. More than this, the Egyptians were not likely to admit under any circumstances. Verse 19 through 22, the passage of the red Sea. The Egyptians had arrived in the near neighborhood of the Israelite camp, at the close of a long day's march towards evening. Having ascertained that the fugitives were still, as they had expected them to be, shut in between the sea and the wilderness, they were content, and made no immediate attack, but encamped over against them. Hereupon, the pillar of the cloud, which was at the time in front of the Israelite camp, probably near the point where God intended the passage of the sea to be effected, removed from this position, and placed itself directly behind the Israelite encampment, between them and the Egyptians. This movement alone was calculated to alarm the latter, and prevent them from stirring till near daybreak, but, the better to secure their inaction, the pillar was made to overshadow them with a deep and preternatural darkness, so that it became almost impossible for them to advance. Meanwhile, on the side which was turned towards the Israelites, the pillar presented the appearance of a bright flame, lighting up the whole encampment, and rendering it as easy to make ready for the march as it would have been by day. Thus, the beasts were collected and laid in the columns marshaled, and prepared to proceed in a certain fixed order, and everything made ready for starting so soon as the bed of the sea should be sufficiently dry. Moses, about nightfall, descending to the water's edge, stretched forth his rod over the waves, and an east wind at once springing up, accompanied perhaps by a strong ebb of the tide, the waters of the Gulf were parted in the vicinity of the modern Suez, and a dry space left between the bitter lakes, which were then a prolongation of the Gulf, and the present sea bed. The space may have been one of considerable width. The Israelites, entering upon it, perhaps about midnight, accomplished the distance, which may not have exceeded a mile, with all their belongings, in the course of 5 or 6 hours, the pillar of the cloud withdrawing itself, as the last Israelites entered the sea bed, and retiring after them like a rear guard. Thus protected, they made the transit in safety, and morning saw them encamped upon the shores of Asia. Verse 19. The angel of God. The divine presence, which manifested itself in the pillar of the cloud, is called indifferently the Lord. Exodus chapter 13 verse 21. Exodus chapter 14 verse 24. And the angel of God, just as the appearance to Moses in the burning bush is termed both God and the angel of the Lord. Exodus chapter 3 verse 2. Which went before, i.e., which ordinarily, and so to speak habitually, preceded the camp. Exodus chapter 13 verse 21. Psalm chapter 78 verse 14. And stood behind them, took up a fixed station for the night, or the greater portion of it. Verse 20. It was a cloud and darkness to them, but it gave light by night to these. Though there is nothing in the Hebrew correspondent to the expressions to them, to these, yet the meaning seems to have been rightly apprehended by our translators. See the Targums of Onkelos and Jonathan, the Syriac version. And among moderns, Noble, Maurer, Rosenmuller, and Kalish. Verse 21. Moses stretched out his hand, as commanded by God. Verse 16. Compare the somewhat similar action of Elijah and Elisha when they divided the Jordan. 2 Kings chapter 2 verses 8 and 14. The Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind, from the Septuagint. Translate a strong south wind, nu nu mu nu tau beta iot alpha. but the Hebrew Kaddim is certainly east rather than south. It is not, however, east in the sense of due east, but would include all the range of the compass between northeast and southeast. If we suppose the Bitter Lakes to have been joined to the Red Sea by a narrow and shallow channel, the action of a southeast wind, by driving the water of the lakes northward, may have easily produced the effect described in the text. A simultaneous ebb of the lower gulf would have further facilitated the passage. The waters were divided. Water remained in the upper extremity of the gulf, now the side of the Bitter Lakes, and also, of course, below Suez. The portion of the sea dried up lay probably between the present southern extremity of the Bitter Lakes and Suez. By the gradual elevation and desiccation of the region, it has passed into permanent dry land. Verse 22. The waters were a wall, i.e., a protection, a defense. Pharaoh could not attack them on either flank, on account of the two bodies of water between which their march lay. He could only come at them by following after them. The metaphor has been by some understood literally, especially on account of the expression in Exodus chapter 15 verse 8, the flood stood upright as an heap, and again that in Psalm chapter 78 verse 13, he made the waters to stand as an heap. But those phrases, occurring in poems, must be taken as poetical, and can scarcely have any weight in determining the meaning of wall here. We must ask ourselves, is there not an economy and a restraint in the exertion, by God even of miraculous power, is more used than is needed for the occasion? And would not all that was needed at this time have been effected by such a division of the sea as we have supposed, without the fluid being converted into a solid, or having otherwise the laws of its being entirely altered? Kalish's statement that the word wall here is not intended to convey the idea of protection, but only of hardness and solidity, seems to us the very reverse of the truth. Protection is at any rate the main idea, and any other is secondary and subordinate. Verses 23 through 31. The destruction of the Egyptians. As the rearguard of the Israelite host, having entered the tract from which the waters had retired, proceeded along it, and left the western end of the isthmus vacant, the pillar of the cloud seems to have followed it up, and withdrawn with it. The Egyptians immediately advanced. Notwithstanding the preternatural darkness, they had become aware, perhaps by means of their ears, of the movement that was taking place, and with early dawn they were under arms, and pressing on the line of the Israelite retreat. They found the channel still dry, and hastily entering it with their chariot force, they hurried forward in pursuit. The first check which they received was wholly supernatural. The Lord looked unto the host of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and of the cloud, and troubled the host of the Egyptians. Verse 24. Details here are wanting, but less cannot be meant than that some strange phenomena connected with the retiring pillar caused a panic, and threw the ranks of the army into confusion. Then followed natural impediments. The Lord took off, or clogged their chariot wheels, and made them go heavily, i.e., the chariot wheels, not by miracle, but by the operation of God's natural laws, sank into the soft sand over which the Israelites had passed easily, having no wheeled vehicles, and the chariots were consequently dragged forward slowly and with difficulty. The double hindrance from the confusion and the stoppage of the chariots so discouraged the Egyptians that after a time they resolved on beating a retreat. Verse 25. They had set out on their return, when Moses, at God's instance, stretched forth his hand once more over the sea, and the waters on both sides began at once to return. The Egyptians saw their danger, and fled against the advancing tide, racing against it, as it were, and seeking to reach the shore, but in vain. the waves came on rapidly. And in the language of verse 28, there was not a man of all those who had entered the dry bed of the sea that was not overwhelmed and drowned in the waters. We should be wrong to press this language to the extreme letter. In graphic narrative, the sacred writers uniformly employ universal expressions, where they mean to give the general fact or general result. The true meaning is that the pursuit altogether failed. Not an Egyptian made his way alive across the strait. All that the Israelites ever saw afterwards of the army that they had so much dreaded, verse 10, was a ghastly mass of corpses thrown up by the tide on the Asiatic shore, verse 30. Verse 23. All Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. Here, as elsewhere, the word translated horsemen probably means the men who rode in the chariots. Observe that the Pharaoh himself is not said to have gone in. Manetho was apt to avoid placing himself in a position of danger. Records of the Past, Volume 4, pages 44 and 45. Nor is any of the infantry said to have entered the bed of the sea. Verse 24. In the morning watch. The morning watch of the Hebrews at this period of their history lasted from 2 at morning to sunrise. Sunrise in Egypt, early in April, would take place about 5:45. The Lord looked unto the host of the Egyptians. The description in Psalm chapter 77 verses 17 and 18 is generally regarded as belonging to this point in the narrative of the Exodus, and may be considered as the traditional exposition of it. The clouds poured out water. The skies sent out a sound. 9 arrows also went abroad. The voice of thy thunder was in the heavens. The lightning lightened the world. The earth trembled and shook. As Josephus says, showers of rain came down from the sky, and dreadful thunders and lightning, with flashes of fire. Thunderbolts also were darted upon them, nor was there anything wont to be sent by God upon men as indications of his wrath, which did not happen upon this occasion, and troubled the host, or disturbed the host, i.e., threw it into confusion. Sigma upsilon rho alpha epsilon, the Septuagint, verse 25, and took off their chariot wheels. The Septuagint has clogged the axles of their chariots. But this is from a reading not at present found in the Hebrew manuscripts. Most modern commentators, however, prefer the reading which gives the verses 26 and 27, and the Lord said. God here interposed a new difficulty. Moses was instructed to stretch out his rod once more, and undo his former work. At the appointed sign, the east wind ceased to blow, and the waters of the bitter lakes, no longer driven to the northwest by its force, flowed back with something of a reflux, while at the same time, the tide having turned, the Red Sea waves came rushing on at unwonted speed. In vain the Egyptians fled. They were met by the advancing floods, which poured in on either side, overwhelming, and covering up all those who had entered on the dangerous path. Verse 28. The chariots and the horsemen, and all the host of Pharaoh. Rather the chariots, and the chariot men of all the host of Pharaoh. So noble correctly. Kalish thinks we are not permitted to suppose that only the Egyptian chariots pursued the Israelites into the sea, while the infantry remained behind, so that the former alone were devoured by the waves. But even he admits that both in this and in the following chapter, and in most other parts generally, the destruction of the chariot force and its warriors is chiefly alluded to, so that this particular stress would perhaps justify that conclusion. What is clear is that no force but the chariot force is said to have entered the bed of the sea in pursuit of Israel. There remained not so much as one of them. On the proper understanding of this statement, see the introductory paragraph to the chapter. Verse 29. Walked, rather, had walked. The waters were a wall, rather, had been a wall. For the meaning of the expression, see note on verse 22. Verse 30. Israel saw the Egyptians dead upon the seashore. Josephus says that, after the passage of the sea by the Israelites, a west wind set in, which, assisted by the current, drove the bodies of the drowned Egyptians to the eastern side of the Gulf, where many of them were cast up upon the shore. In this way Moses, according to him, obtained weapons and armor for a considerable number of Israelites. Verse 31. And Israel saw that great work. The work was, at the least, one, the almost entire destruction of that arm of the service, the chariot force on which the Egyptian kings mainly relied for success in all their wars, and two, the defeat and disgrace of the Egyptian king himself, in an expedition for which he was alone responsible, involving permanent discredit to his military capacity, and naturally tending to shake his authority over his subjects. It secured the Israelites from further persecution, mainly by the reminiscences which it left behind, but partly also by removing them to a distance from the natural course of Egyptian warlike or commercial movement. Though Egypt had mining establishments in the Sinaitic Peninsula, at Wadi Megara and Sarabit el-Kadhim, yet as these were avoided by the Israelites on their way to Sinai, and never afterwards approached, there naturally was no collision between them and the pharaonic garrisons at those sites. Still more remote were they during their wanderings from the Egyptian military route, which proceeded along the coast from Pelusium to Gaza, and then ran northwards through the Shephelah. Thus the passage of the Red Sea brought one phase in the life of the people to an end, and was the commencement of another. It separated them from Egypt until the time came when their king would hold communication with its monarch on equal terms. 1 Kings chapter 3 verse 1. It secured their independence, and raised them at once into a nation. It further caused them to exchange the artificial life of a bureaucratical and convention-loving community for the open space and untrammeled freedom of the desert. It thus rejuvenated and reinvigorated the race, and enabled them to enter on that career of conquest which culminated in the kingdom, may we not say the empire, of David. Some writers have supposed that the blow to the Egyptian power was greater than here represented. They believe the entire warrior caste or class to have taken part in the expedition, and to have been destroyed in the Red Sea. Thus, they describe the calamity as the total annihilation of the whole military force of the Egyptians' Kailash. They also believe the Pharaoh to have perished with his host. To the present writer it seems that the former opinion is contrary both to the text of Scripture and to the after course of Egyptian history. For it is agreed on all hands that Egypt continued nearly as powerful as before, while the latter he regards as at least exceedingly doubtful. Psalm chapter 86 verse 15 is quoted as asserting it. But it appears to him, 1, that overthrow is not necessarily death, and 2, that Pharaoh and his host may be put for Pharaoh's host by Hendiadys. The absence of any prophecy that God would take the Pharaoh's life, and the entire silence of Moses on the subject in chapters 14 and 15 seems to be scarcely explicable on any other theory than that he escaped, not having accompanied his chariot force in its rash pursuit of the Israelites.